Billionaire accused a black single mom of theft, then his son confessed. At 1:13 in the morning, Tanesha Bell found a bank envelope under the white leather sofa in the donor lounge at Whitaker Hall. It held $60,000 in cash, wrapped in neat paper bands, with a withdrawal slip behind it, showing that $80,000 had left a private account earlier that evening. Tanesha was a black single mother on the night cleaning crew, and that money could have repaired her daughter's cracked violin, paid the conservatory audition fee, fixed the car, and given their little apartment a few months of quiet. She returned every dollar she found before sunrise. By noon, she was standing outside a back office while the white billionaire, whose name was on the building, asked why $20,000 was missing. Whitaker Hall sounded different after the donors went home. During the gala, the building had a public voice. Applause from the main stage, laughter under the marble ceiling, wine glasses tapping, and the polished confidence of people who had paid enough to feel generous. The air smelled of expensive perfume and fresh flowers arranged in towering displays. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across faces that had never worried about whether the rent would be paid on time. Women in designer gowns moved through the spaces with the easy grace of people who had never been told they did not belong somewhere. Men in tailored suits shook hands and made promises that would change the course of organizations, all while standing on floors that Tanesha and her colleagues would scrub until they shone. After midnight, the hall spoke in smaller sounds. Air vents sighed behind polished wood, releasing the accumulated warmth of hundreds of bodies that had filled the space for hours. Ice melted in abandoned glasses, creating small puddles that would need to be wiped away before morning. The service elevator opened and closed with the patient fatigue of something used by people expected to be unseen. Its metal walls bearing the scratches and dents of carts loaded with cleaning supplies and trash bags. Tanesha knew that second voice better than almost anyone. She had worked the night shift at Whitaker Hall for 7 years, long enough to memorize every creak in the floorboards, every flicker of the lights, every shadow that stretched across the marble floors as the moon moved through the sky. She knew which hallway light flickered when rain came from the east, a soft stuttering that happened like clockwork whenever a storm rolled in from that direction. She knew which brass handles needed to be wiped twice after donor receptions, the ones that showed fingerprints more easily because of the way the light hit them. She knew which private elevator clicked before it opened, a warning sound that gave her just enough time to step back and let the doors slide open. She did not hate the building. Hate was too heavy to carry through a night shift, too exhausting to maintain while scrubbing toilets and emptying trash cans, and polishing surfaces that would be touched by gloved hands the next evening. She understood the arrangement. Some people had names on the wall, carved in stone or etched in brass, their contributions celebrated with plaques and photographs and speeches. Some people kept the wall clean, working in the shadows to maintain the illusion of effortless elegance that donors expected when they walked through the doors. That night, the donor lounge looked as if wealth had passed through and shed its skin. Programs lay folded on low stone tables, their glossy pages still warm from the printing press, filled with the names of people who had given enough to be listed in order of their generosity. Champagne rings dried on coasters, leaving behind sticky circles that would need to be wiped away before the next event. A silk scarf had been left on the arm of a sofa, beautiful enough to prove the person who owned it did not have to make things last, did not have to worry about whether something could be repaired or if it would simply be replaced. Tanesha moved through the room with a trash bag in one hand and a folded cloth in the other, slow enough to notice what guests never realized they left behind. She had learned to move with a kind of invisibility, the way someone learns to navigate a space where they are present but not seen, necessary but not acknowledged. Her sneakers made no sound on the marble floor, worn smooth by years of foot traffic. Her movements were efficient, economical, each gesture calculated to accomplish the maximum amount of work with the minimum amount of wasted energy. A room always told the truth after the guests were gone. The carefully constructed facades fell away when there was no one left to impress. The champagne glasses revealed how much had actually been drunk versus how much had been swirled and sipped for appearance. The programs showed which performances had drawn applause and which had been endured with polite silence. The discarded napkins and empty plates told the story of appetites satisfied, of indulgence that would never be acknowledged in the morning light. She bent down to pick up a program that had slid under the white sofa, one of 3 identical pieces of furniture arranged in a semicircle around a low coffee table. The sofa was upholstered in Italian leather, so soft it felt almost like fabric, so expensive that a single scratch would cost more than Tanesha made in a week. That was when she saw the envelope, half hidden in shadow near the back leg, thick enough to make her stop before she touched it, substantial enough to suggest that whatever was inside mattered. The envelope was not sealed. Tanesha looked once toward the open doorway, then toward the dark glass facing the private terrace. No one was there. The building had settled around her in its expensive sleep, the hum of the air conditioning, the only sound besides her own breathing. She could hear the distant echo of a car door slamming somewhere outside, the last guest departing. The final note of an evening that had ended hours ago for everyone except the people who cleaned up after it. She pulled the envelope out and placed it on the table. The first thing she saw was cash, stacked in neat bundles wrapped in paper bands that banks use to denote specific amounts. The second was the folded withdrawal slip tucked behind it, the kind of document that existed to create a paper trail, to prove that money had moved from one place to another in a way that could be tracked and verified. Her hands did not shake right away. In the moment itself, her body became very still, the way a body does when it understands danger before the mind has finished naming it. This was the kind of stillness that came before flight or fight, the kind that allowed a person to assess a situation with complete clarity before making a decision that could change everything. She counted because numbers mattered. If she was going to tell the truth, she needed to know the size of it, needed to be able to speak with precision about what she had found. She separated the bundles carefully, not wanting to disturb the order in which they had been placed, and counted each one individually. $60,000. The slip said 80. For several seconds, Tanesha stared at the difference between the money on the table and the number on the paper. $20,000 was missing before she ever touched the envelope, and that did not comfort her. It frightened her because a missing number inside a rich building had a way of looking for the nearest poor person to explain it. She had seen it happen before, not here perhaps, but in other places where people with power needed someone to blame when things went wrong. The mathematics of suspicion always worked the same way. Money disappeared, and the person with the least power to defend themselves became the most likely suspect. On her refrigerator at home, under a blue magnet shaped like a peach, was the repair estimate from Darden Strings. Bridge adjustment, open seam work, replacement bow, new strings. The total had been written in bold at the bottom, $840. $840 that she did not have, that she could not save for at the rate she was going, that represented months of skipped meals, and delayed bill payments and saying no to her daughter one more time. Beneath that was the audition notice from South Atlanta Youth Conservatory, with one line she had read so many times it felt less like a sentence and more like a locked door. Applicant must provide instrument in playable condition. The words had become a kind of mantra, a reminder of everything that stood between her daughter and the future she deserved. Playable condition. Not perfect, not expensive, not the kind of instrument that cost more than a car. Just playable. Just good enough to allow talent to be heard without the interference of cracks and buzzes and strings that could not hold their tune. Her daughter, Imani, played on a pawnshop violin with a small crack near the body and an A string that buzzed when the note climbed high enough to ask more from the instrument than the instrument could give. The violin had cost $300, paid for in installments over 6 months, and it had been a struggle even to afford that. Amani had learned to play around it, the way children without enough learn to play around everything. Noise, late buses, tired adults, missing tools, and rooms that do not expect them to enter. She adjusted her bow pressure when she approached the problematic notes. She shifted her fingering slightly to compensate for the crack. She developed a kind of musical workaround that was both impressive and heartbreaking, a testament to her skill and a reminder of what she was missing. Inside the violin case, Amani had taped a little note in pencil. A string, be nice. The words were written in her daughter's careful handwriting, the kind that took time and effort, the kind that showed she was trying to make her letters perfect even when everything else was falling apart. It was the kind of note that broke Tanesha's heart every time she saw it, because it showed a child making peace with an object, asking for kindness from something that could not give it, accepting limitation as a fact of life rather than a problem to be solved. Tanesha thought about that note while $60,000 sat on the table, and the slip said 20,000 more had existed somewhere before the envelope reached her. She thought about the car that coughed before it started, the engine making a sound that suggested it was living on borrowed time. She thought about the rent envelope, always thin, always arriving just barely before the deadline. She thought about the grocery list with items crossed out before they were bought, the luxuries that became necessities that became impossibilities as the total climbed too high. She thought about her daughter standing in a borrowed school dress for an audition that could open a door if the violin did not betray her first, if the buzz did not come at the wrong moment, if the judges could hear past the instrument to the talent beneath it. The wanting rose in Tanesha like heat, a physical sensation that started in her chest and spread through her body until she could feel it in her fingertips. It was not greed. It was not theft. It was the desperate, clawing need of a mother who wanted to give her child the tools to succeed, who was tired of watching talent wither for lack of support, who was exhausted by the constant calculation of what could be afforded and what could not. She was not above temptation. She was not made of cleaner material than other people. She was a tired mother standing alone in the room where money had fallen into her hands at the exact place where her life hurt most. The envelope represented everything she could not give her daughter: security, opportunity, the chance to be judged on merit rather than on the quality of her instruments. That was what made the choice cost something. If she had not needed the money, if her life had been comfortable, if Amani's violin had been whole and her car had run smoothly, and their rent had been paid with money left over, then returning the envelope would have been easy. It would have been the obvious choice, the only choice, the kind of decision that did not require thought. But she did need it, desperately, in ways that went beyond simple want into the territory of need, of necessity, of the kind of lack that shapes a person's entire existence. Tanesha placed the cash back into the envelope exactly as she had found it, keeping the withdrawal slip inside, and carried everything downstairs to the security desk. Each step felt like a small act of faith, a declaration that who she was mattered more than what she needed, that integrity was not just a word for people who could afford it. Malcolm Price was working the lobby that night. He was a steady man with tired eyes and the careful quiet of someone who had spent years protecting buildings that did not belong to him. He was in his 50s, with graying hair and hands that showed the wear of work, and he had been at Whitaker Hall for 12 years, long enough to see generations of donors come and go, long enough to understand the rhythms of the building better than most of the people whose names were on the plaques. When Tanesha stepped out of the service corridor, he saw enough in her face to stand before she spoke, to recognize that something had happened that required his full attention. "I found this in the donor lounge," Tanesha said, holding the envelope with both hands so he could see she was not hiding it, so he could see that she was approaching this with transparency, with nothing to conceal. Malcolm looked at the envelope, then at her. "What is in it?" "Cash. $60,000. There is a withdrawal slip inside that says 80. His expressions changed just enough to show he understood the danger in the gap, the space between what should be there and what was there, the place where suspicion lived and grew. He had seen this before. Not exactly this, but variations on the theme. Situations where money went missing, and the people with the least power were expected to explain it. "Then we log exactly what you found," he said, turning his monitor slightly so she could see the incident form. Not what anybody expected to be there. That mattered. It told her he was not asking her to trust a record she could not read, was not going to create a document that could be twisted later to suggest she had admitted to something she had not done. He was going to create a record that reflected reality, not expectation. And in a building like this, that was a kind of courage. Tanesha dictated the details slowly. Donor lounge, under the white sofa, 1:13 in the morning. Envelope unsealed when found. $60,000 present. Withdrawal slip showed 80,000. She spoke clearly, making sure each word was recorded accurately, understanding that this document might be the only thing that stood between her and a false accusation. Malcolm typed every line, his fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, and when he was finished, he printed the log and slid it across the desk. "Read it before you sign." Tanesha read every word. Because paper had a memory longer than people. Documents survived long after conversations were forgotten, long after memories faded, long after the people involved had moved on to other concerns. She checked each detail, making sure it matched what she had said, making sure there were no ambiguities that could be exploited later. Then she signed her name beneath the truth, her handwriting steady despite the tremor in her hands. Malcolm placed the envelope in the night safe. The metal door closed with a soft click, a sound that should have signaled the end of the matter, the resolution of a problem, before it could become a crisis. It should have sounded like safety. It sounded like the first part of a trap she had not built. The call came before lunch, after Tanesha had slept less than 3 hours, and before Imani came home from school. She had lain in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the events of the night before, wondering if she had done the right thing, wondering if doing the right thing would matter in a world that seemed designed to punish people like her for their honesty. A woman from Whitaker Hall administration asked Tanesha to come in early. The woman's voice had that careful office softness people use when they already know the conversation will hurt someone with less power, the kind of gentleness that is not kindness but strategy. A way of delivering bad news, while maintaining plausible deniability about its impact. "What is this about?" Tanesha asked, sitting on the edge of her bed and looking toward the kitchen, where the audition notice hung beside the repair estimate, where every surface was covered with reminders of what she could not afford. "There is a question about last night's incident log." "I turned in what I found. Yes, Miss Bell. Mr. Whitaker would like to speak with you, and Dana Coleman from operations will be present." Tanesha knew Dana Coleman. Dana oversaw donor lounge access after major events, carried a clipboard like a badge of authority, and usually said the cleaning team instead of the names of people who had worked in the building for years. She was efficient, organized, and completely incapable of seeing the people who kept the building running as anything more than functions to be managed. "I want Malcolm Price in the room," Tanesha said. There was a pause on the line, the kind of silence that suggested the request had not been anticipated, that it complicated a script that had already been written. "I can ask whether, I am not asking whether." Malcolm logged the envelope. If this is about the envelope, he is part of the truth. At Whitaker Hall, Malcolm was behind the security desk when Tanesha walked through the glass doors. He did not call out to her. He only looked at her a moment longer than usual, and that look told her the conversation had already been shaped. Before she arrived, that decisions had been made in rooms where she was not present, that the outcome had been determined by people who had never had to choose between integrity and survival. She stopped at the desk, keeping one hand on the strap of her tote bag. "Where?" Malcolm lowered his voice so the people near the elevators would not hear. "The back office behind donor services." Mr. Whitaker is there. Preston Whitaker is there. Dana Coleman is there. Preston is the son? Malcolm nodded. He handled the private instrument purchase after the gala. The bank envelope was his responsibility. And now? Now the withdrawal slip says 80, my log says 60, and he says the envelope had the full amount when he left it in the lounge. Tanesha looked down the hallway toward donor services. So they are not calling me in to thank me. No, Malcolm said, because pretending would have been insulting because she deserved the truth even when it was ugly. You will be in the room. I already told them I would. That steadied her more than she wanted to admit. Having an ally, even one who could not protect her, even one who was powerless to change the outcome, made the burden slightly lighter. Malcolm walked beside her down the hall, not in front like security escorting a problem, and not behind like security watching one, but beside her. In that building, the difference mattered. It was a small act of solidarity, a way of saying that he saw her, as a person rather than a situation to be managed. The back office was small, with a rectangular table, a wall of file cabinets, and a framed photograph of Whitaker Hall's opening night. The photograph showed a younger Graham Whitaker cutting a ribbon, surrounded by donors and dignitaries, all of them smiling with the confidence of people who believed they were building something important. The room smelled of paper and toner and the faint chemical scent of cleaning products, and it felt like a place where decisions were made that affected people who would never know why their lives had changed. Graham Whitaker stood near the window. He was a tall man with silver hair and the kind of presence that filled a room, the kind of person who had spent his entire life being listened to, being obeyed, being assumed to be right. His son Preston sat at the table with one ankle over the other knee, trying to look inconvenienced rather than afraid, his body language suggesting that this was a waste of his valuable time rather than a moment that could destroy someone's life. Dana Coleman had a folder open in front of her and 3 pens arranged in a line, as if order on the table could make disorder easier to manage, as if aligning her writing instruments could align the facts to match the story she wanted to tell. Graham spoke first. Ms. Bell, thank you for coming. Tanesha did not sit until Malcolm pulled out the chair nearest the door and stood beside it. Then she sat, not because they had offered, but because she had chosen. Where she would answer from, because positioning mattered in a room like this, because she would not give them any advantage they did not already have. Dana glanced at her folder. We appreciate that you reported the envelope. You should, Tanesha said. Dana looked up, surprised by the plainness of it, by the lack of deference, by the fact that this woman who cleaned their floors was speaking to them as an equal rather than a subordinate. The issue, Dana continued, recovering her composure, is that the withdrawal slip inside the envelope recorded $80,000. Mr. Price's log, which you signed, records $60,000 recovered. That is what I found. Preston leaned forward slightly. When I left the lounge, the full amount was there. Tanesha turned to him, giving him the full weight of her attention. You left $80,000 in an unsealed envelope under a sofa? I did not leave it under the sofa. It must have fallen. Money like that does not fall under a sofa by itself. A person puts it somewhere careless, and then people like me are asked to explain what careless people lose. Dana started to speak, but Graham raised one hand without looking away from Tanesha, silencing his operations manager with a gesture. Preston's voice sharpened. I am only saying you were the person who found it. No, Tanesha said. You are saying I was the first person in this room easy enough to suspect. The office went quiet. Tanesha let the silence stay there. She had learned not to rush into spaces where people expected her to make their discomfort easier, had learned that silence could be a weapon when used correctly, that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was refuse to fill the void. Then she looked at Graham. I returned $60,000. I needed more than he remembered holding, she said, each word steady enough for Malcolm to hear clearly. And I am still the one sitting in this chair. Graham's face shifted, but not enough to become trust. She could see the calculation behind his eyes, the weighing of options, the consideration of how this situation could be resolved with the minimum amount of disruption to his world. Dana folded her hands. No one has made a formal accusation. Tanesha looked at the folder. Then do not use formal words to hide informal suspicion. Graham finally sat across from her. That mattered, but not enough. It was a gesture, but gestures did not change outcomes. Ms. Bell, he said, until we determine what happened before the envelope reached the safe, we have to limit access to donor areas. With pay? Tanesha asked. Dana blinked, but Graham answered before she could. Yes, with pay. For how long? 48 hours. If we need longer, you will receive written notice. Good, Tanesha said. Write that too. Dana made a note, because by then she understood that Tanesha would remember that this woman who cleaned floors was keeping a record in her mind that would outlast any document they created. At the door, Tanesha turned to Preston, because Graham was not the person who had placed the first shadow on her name. Graham was reacting to a situation. Preston had created it. If you remember one thing about this morning, she said, remember that I brought back what you lost before anyone knew I had it. You should ask yourself why that still was not enough. Preston said nothing. He looked at the table, at the wall, anywhere but at her, and in that avoidance she saw everything she needed to know. Tanesha walked through the marble lobby with her head level, because lowering it would not make the room kinder and raising it too high would give them another story to use. Only when she reached the sidewalk did her fingers begin to shake. Only when she was outside the building, breathing air that did not smell of money and power, did her body allow itself to react to what had just happened. Camille Reed came over that evening with baked chicken in a foil pan and a face that said she had heard enough from Malcolm to know the shape of the trouble. Camille had worked at Whitaker Hall longer than some donors had been donors. She was the head cleaner on the night crew, a woman with sharp eyes, tired knees, and a habit of calling younger women baby in a way that did not soften the truth. She had seen generations of young black women navigate spaces that were not designed for them, had watched them be accused of things they did not do, had held them while they cried over injustices that could not be fixed. She set the pan on the stove, looked once at the repair estimate on the refrigerator, and then looked at Tanesha. You ate today? I had coffee. That is not food. I know what coffee is. Then do not make me ask again. Amani was by the window with the violin under her chin, playing a scale slowly, enough to hear the place where the instrument betrayed her. The A string buzzed on the climb, and the sound made Tanesha's stomach tighten because it was small, ordinary, and cruel. Poverty did not always arrive as hunger or an eviction notice. Sometimes it arrived as one note that would not ring clean no matter how carefully a child placed her fingers, no matter how many hours she practiced, no matter how much talent she possessed. Amani stopped playing. Mama, are they saying you took something? Tanesha crossed the room and sat on the arm of the couch so they were nearly eye to eye. She did not kneel because Amani was not a baby, and the truth deserved to meet her standing as much as possible. She would not lie to her daughter, would not pretend the world was fair when it was not, would not teach her that honesty would be rewarded when experience said otherwise. They are asking questions about the money I found, because some of it is missing? Tanesha's breath caught. Who told you that? I heard you on the phone. Tanesha closed her eyes for one beat, then opened them. Before the silence became frightening, she had forgotten that walls were thin, that children heard more than adults realized, that trying to protect them sometimes meant underestimating their ability to understand. Yes, the paper inside said, there should have been more money than what I found, but you gave back what you found. Yes. All of it? Amani looked down at the violin in her lap. Her thumb moved over the worn edge of the case, tracing the scratches and dents that told the story of an instrument that had been loved despite its limitations. How much was it? Tanesha did not want to answer, but children learn the size of fear from the parts adults hide. She would not teach her daughter that truth was only safe when it was convenient, that some things were too big to speak aloud. $60,000. Amana's face changed slowly as the number entered her mind and opened doors. $60,000 was not just money. It was possibility, it was solutions, it was a future that looked different from the present, that could fix the violin, yes, and the car, yes, and the audition, yes. Amani's voice grew smaller and you still gave it back. Tanesha touched the violin case because sometimes touching the thing between you is easier than touching the wound itself. If it is not ours, we do not build our life on it. Amani looked at the note taped inside the case. A string. Be nice. What if doing right does not make people believe you? The question hurt because it was not childish. It was the kind of question that came from watching the world closely, from paying attention to how things actually worked rather than how they were supposed to work. Tanesha took longer with that answer. Then doing right has to be about who you are, not what they give you for it. After dinner, Imani practiced again. Camille washed dishes even though Tanesha told her not to, and Tanesha sat at the table listening to her daughter fight the A string. The buzz came and went, rough and stubborn, but Imani did not quit. She adjusted her bow, softened her pressure, and played around the flaw without letting the flaw become the whole song. That was when Tanesha understood something she had not been able to name before. Imani did not play like a child who had been given enough. She played like a child who had learned to make beauty negotiate. She played like someone who understood that perfection was a luxury, and that excellence had to be forged in the space between what you had and what you needed. Later, when Camille was putting on her coat, she stopped beside Tanesha at the door. "Baby, when they get you back in that building, you keep your voice low and your words exact. Rooms like that will forgive a rich boy's panic before they forgive a black woman's anger. I know you know. I am saying it anyway, because knowing does not make it lighter." Tanesha leaned against the doorframe. "I wanted that money for about 1 full minute." Camille's face softened. "Only one?" Tanesha almost laughed. Camille touched her arm. "That does not make you bad. That makes you honest. A good woman is not a woman who never wants. A good woman is a woman who knows what wanting is and still does not let it name her." After Camille left, Imani came from the bedroom holding the violin case. "Mama?" "Yes? At the audition, I do not want them to know about the money, or Mr. Whitaker, or that the violin is broken because we could not fix it." Tanesha studied her daughter's face. There was no shame in it, only a fierce little dignity standing guard. "I do not want them to feel sorry before I play," Imani said. "I want them to hear me first." Tanesha nodded. "Then that is what they will do." Graham Whitaker began to doubt his son because of a detail Preston should not have known. It was not a dramatic recording or a hidden camera. Truth entered the room through a small word, placed where it did not belong, through a piece of information that could only have come from someone who had seen the money before it was logged. The next morning, Graham sat in his office with the incident log, the withdrawal slip, and Dana Coleman's event notes spread across his desk. The recovered cash had been logged as 6 paper-banded stacks. The bank slip listed 8, 2 were missing. 2 stacks of $10,000 each, gone before the envelope reached the night safe. Graham remembered Preston saying something before Tanesha arrived, something he had not thought about at the time, but that now stood out like a beacon. "The 2 chase bands were definitely there when I left." At the time, Graham had heard only worry, only a son concern, about money that had gone missing under his watch. Now he heard knowledge. No one had told Preston which 2 bands were missing. The incident log did not specify. Dana's notes did not include that detail. The only person who could have known was the person who had taken them. When Preston entered the office, he brought coffee with him, as if habit could soften the conversation, as if caffeine could make the truth easier to swallow. He looked confident, untroubled, the way someone looks when they believe they are beyond consequences. Graham did not offer him a chair. "Did you take the 20,000? Preston stopped just inside the door. "What?" Graham held up the withdrawal slip. "Do not make me ask twice." Preston looked toward the window, then at the floor, then back at his father. Those 3 glances told Graham more than any answer could. They told him that his son was calculating, that he was weighing options, that he was trying to determine how much truth he could tell without destroying himself. It was temporary, Preston said. Graham stared at him. Temporary? I was going to replace it before anyone counted. Before anyone counted, Graham repeated, because some phrases deserve to hear themselves, deserve to be spoken aloud so their absurdity becomes clear. Preston placed the coffee on the side table. His hand was not steady now. The confidence was cracking, revealing the fear beneath. I owed money from something stupid. I took 2 stacks. I thought I could put it back Monday. Then the cleaner found the envelope before I could fix it. The cleaner has a name. Preston flushed. Tanesha Bell. You let her sit in that room knowing you had taken the money. I never said she stole it. No, you let us say it around you. Preston's face tightened. I thought it would get handled. There it was, clean and terrible. The entire philosophy of privilege distilled into 5 words. I thought it would get handled. Not I thought I would fix it. Not I thought I would take responsibility. Not I thought I would tell the truth. It would get handled. By someone else, by the system, by the invisible machinery that protected people like him from consequences. Graham walked to the window and looked across the plaza toward Whitaker Hall. From this distance, the building looked noble. It looked like a testament to generosity, to culture, to the belief that wealth could be used for good. He had spent years believing that if something looked noble from far enough away, nobility would eventually fill it. He had believed that the building's purpose would sanctify its donors, that good works would wash away the sins of how the money was made and how it was managed. Handled by who? Graham asked. Dana? Malcolm? Some quiet correction after Ms. Bell lost shifts, reputation, sleep? I did not think it would go that far. Graham turned. Far is what happens to people who do not have our last name. Preston looked more embarrassed than ashamed, and that difference landed in Graham harder than he expected. His son had harmed someone and still believed the worst part of the day was being confronted by his father. He was upset about being caught, not about what he had done. He was concerned about his discomfort, not about the destruction he had casually visited on another person's life. You are going to tell her, Graham said. You are going to tell Malcolm. You are going to tell Dana. You are going to sign the correction. And you are going to tell Ms. Bell directly, without using the word temporary. Preston stared at him. You would put me through that? Graham looked at his son and heard for the first time the whole education money had given him. He heard the lessons that had been taught and the lessons that had been missed. He heard the voice of a system that had protected Preston from ever having to face the consequences of his actions, that had taught him that problems could be delegated, that discomfort could be avoided, that truth was optional when it was inconvenient. I already put you through something worse, Graham said. I let you believe mistakes become smaller when they land on someone else. That afternoon, Graham went to Tanesha's apartment and made the mistake of bringing a check. Tanesha opened the door but did not invite him in. Behind her, the apartment was small and carefully kept, with music sheets on the table and the violin case near the window. Amani stood farther back, watching with the guarded stillness of a child who knew adults could change a room by entering it, who understood that power dynamics shifted when wealthy white men crossed thresholds into spaces where they did not belong. Ms. Bell, Graham said, my son took the missing money. Tanesha's face did not move, but something in her eyes became colder. She had known perhaps, or at least suspected, but hearing it confirmed was different from guessing. It transformed suspicion into fact, and facts had weight. Then say that at Whitaker Hall. Say it to Malcolm. Yes. Say it to Dana. Yes. Say it in writing. Yes. She looked at the envelope in his hand. What is that? Graham already knew he had misjudged the hallway, had misread the situation, had fallen back on the tools he knew best when what was needed was something else entirely. But pride answered before humility could catch up. A check. For your daughter's instrument repair, audition expenses, lost wages, and anything else this has cost you. Tanesha stepped into the hallway and pulled the door almost closed behind her, shielding Amani from the offer as if it were something with a smell, something that could contaminate the air if it got inside. My daughter is not your apology. Graham lowered the check. I did not mean to make her that. You had someone look into us. I asked enough to understand what the money would have meant. No, Tanesha said, not loudly, because loud would have been easier for him to dismiss. You asked enough to decide what kind of check would make you feel like a decent man again. The sentence landed where it was meant to land. It cut through his justifications, through his belief that he was helping, through his conviction that money could fix what money had helped break. Graham did not defend himself. That was the first useful thing he did. He stood there, holding the check, understanding that he had no defense that would not make things worse. If you want to make it right, Tanesha said, you start with the truth. Preston says what he did in front of the people who heard the suspicion. My record says I returned what I found. Not verbally, not quietly. On paper, yes. And if you want to help my daughter, you do not turn her into a photograph for your foundation. Graham looked through the narrow opening of the door and saw Amani watching them. She was not hiding. She was observing, learning, filing away this moment for later reference. She plays? She plays, and she wants to be heard before anyone feels sorry. What do you want me to do? Tanesha studied him long enough for the question to stop being easy. She made him wait, made him understand that answers were not automatic, that her time and her dignity had value. You know people at the conservatory. Ask whether they still allow blind late auditions. No name, no donor note, no camera, no introduction from Graham Whitaker. If she is good enough, they will hear it. If she is not, she will learn the truth without being used. Graham looked down at the check in his hand. It had become exactly what she said it was. An apology trying to wear money's clothes. It was a way of making himself feel better without actually addressing the harm that had been done. I will take this back, he said. You should. Before she closed the door, Graham said, I am sorry. Tanesha paused. Be sorry after it costs you something. Then the door closed gently, which somehow felt worse than if she had slammed it. A slam would have been anger, and anger could be understood, could be worked with. This was something else. This was dismissal. This was a woman who had already moved past him, who had already determined that he was not worth her rage. Preston confessed in the same back office where Tanesha had been questioned. That was one of her conditions. No different room. No polished apology on foundation letterhead. No private call from a rich son who wanted to feel brave without looking at the beast he had harmed. The truth would be spoken in the place where the lie had taken root, where suspicion had been planted and allowed to grow. Malcolm sat at the table because he had logged the envelope. Dana sat beside the file cabinet with her folder open, her 3 pens still arranged in a line, as if she could organize her way out of complicity. Camille stood near the door, arms folded, because Tanesha had asked her to come, and sometimes a witness is a form of shelter, a way of ensuring that what happened in this room would be remembered correctly. Preston stood across from Tanesha. Graham did not stand beside him. He stood near the wall, close enough to hear and far enough not to protect. This was his son's moment, his son's responsibility, and he would not interfere. Preston began with his eyes on the table. I took $20,000 from the envelope before leaving the donor lounge. Tanesha waited. She did not speak, did not react, did not give him the satisfaction of knowing how his words affected her. I allowed Ms. Bell to be questioned, even though I knew she had returned what she found. Camille made a small sound, a noise of disgust that she did not bother to suppress. Preston corrected himself. I let suspicion fall on her because telling the truth would have exposed what I had done. Tanesha's face did not change. She had heard enough lies in her life to recognize the shape of truth when it finally appeared, and this was truth, ugly and incomplete and insufficient, but truth nonetheless. What did you think would happen to me? She asked. Preston looked at Graham. Tanesha's voice stayed even. Not him. Me. Preston looked back at her. I thought it would be reviewed, and if the review went badly, I did not think that far. Tanesha nodded once, almost to herself. That is the part you need to remember. You did not need to hate me to harm me. You only needed to believe my life could hold the mess until yours got clean. Preston had no useful phrase left. There was nothing he could say that would make this better, that would undo what had been done, that would restore what had been taken. The written correction came before Tanesha left the building. She refused the first draft because it said the matter had been resolved. She refused the second because it said no evidence supported wrongdoing. The third finally said what it needed to say. Tanesha Bell recovered and returned the full amount she found in the donor lounge. No money was taken by Ms. Bell. The missing funds were removed before Ms. Bell entered the room. Any implication otherwise was incorrect. She read it twice, then folded it and placed it in her bag. Truth on paper was not justice, but it was something justice could stand on. It was a foundation, imperfect and incomplete, but solid enough to build upon. The blind audition happened the next evening at South Atlanta Youth Conservatory. The building was smaller than Whitaker Hall, with brick walls, old wood floors, and flyers taped to the front office glass. Tanesha liked it more than she expected. It looked used, and things used for their purpose have a dignity polished rooms sometimes lack. This was a place where music happened, where talent was cultivated, where the focus was on what could be created rather than what could be displayed. Amani received a number at the desk. No name, no story, no donor note, just number 12. In the waiting room, other children tuned instruments that looked newer than hers. One girl played a warm-up run so fast that Amani looked down at her shoes. Tanesha saw the movement and leaned closer. Do not listen sideways. Amani frowned. What does that mean? You know what it means. Do not let somebody else warming up loud make you forget what you came to play. When the door opened and a woman called for number 12, Amani stood. For a moment, the violin case looked too heavy in her hand. Then she adjusted her grip and walked in. A screen had been placed between the judges and the performer. This was the point of a blind audition, the entire purpose, to remove every variable except the music itself. No one would know her race, her age, her background, her economic status. No one would know about the cracked violin or the missing money or the accusation that had nearly destroyed her mother's reputation. They would only know what they heard. Tanesha stayed in the waiting room with her hands folded, listening through the wall and trying not to pray in a way that sounded like bargaining. She had done everything she could do. The rest was up to her daughter, up to the talent that had been forged in difficulty, up to the music that had learned to speak. Despite the obstacles, the first notes came carefully, too carefully. The room was dry and the old violin resisted the way old things do when asked for courage. When Amani climbed to the A string, the buzz appeared, thin and stubborn, the sound that had haunted them for months. Tanesha closed her eyes. Inside the audition room, Amani heard it too. For half a breath, the broken sound tried to pull her out of the music and back into every room where not enough had followed her. It tried to remind her of the pawn shop, of the repair estimate, of the note taped inside the case, asking a string to be nice. Then she adjusted the bow, softened her pressure, and kept playing. The next phrase did not hide the instrument's flaw. It answered it. It acknowledged the limitation and moved forward anyway, the way Imani had been moving forward her entire life. By the middle of the piece, the old violin had not become better, but Imani had. She had lived with limitation long enough to know where its edges were, and she moved around them with a patience no teacher could have bought for her. She did not play perfectly. She played truthfully, and sometimes truth has a sound skill alone cannot make. When the piece ended, the silence lasted just long enough for Tanesha to feel her whole body waiting. Then someone behind the screen said, "Thank you, number 12." The acceptance call came 4 days later. Amani did not receive a crown, a miracle, or a spotlight. She received a place in the junior string program, a partial scholarship based on her score, and access to the conservatory's instrument lending room. The email said nothing about Tanesha, Graham Whitaker, Preston, the envelope, or the accusation. It only said that number 12 had earned a seat. That was why Tanesha let herself cry in the laundry room after Amani went to bed, quietly, into a towel. Not because a rich man had saved them, but because for once a door had opened without asking her daughter to bleed in front of it first. The recital took place months later in a small hall with wooden chairs, a low stage, and a piano that had been tuned well enough. Tanesha arrived near the last minute because her bus had been late, and her shift had run over. She had changed out of her uniform shirt in a restroom, but she could not change the tiredness from her shoulders. Near the back, one seat was empty beside a white woman with a leather purse resting on it. Tanesha paused at the end of the row. The woman glanced up, then down at the purse, and for 1 second, the old room appeared again, the room that did not accuse loudly, the room that simply decided where a person did not belong. Tanesha did not ask. She stood at the back wall. On stage, Amani stepped forward with a borrowed violin from the conservatory's lending room. It was not famous, not priceless, not the kind of instrument donors whispered about. It was simply whole. Its seams held, its bow was straight, its A string weighted without a buzz inside it. Graham Whitaker stood near the rear doors, not in the front row, not beside a photographer, not where anyone would have to thank him before the music began. Preston stood beside him. For once, Preston was not looking at his phone. Amani lifted the violin. The first note crossed the room clean. Tanesha felt it before she understood it. The sound did not fight its way out. It opened. It moved through the small hall with a steadiness the old violin had never been able to give her, and when the melody climbed toward the A string, Tanesha's hand closed around the program she held. The note rang clear. No buzz, no apology, no crack in the sound where poverty used to answer. The white woman in the row ahead looked at the stage, then at the purse on the empty seat beside her. Slowly, without making a show of it, she moved the purse to the floor. Tanesha saw. She waited one breath, then she stepped into the row and sat down. No one clapped yet. The music was still speaking. Graham saw the movement from the back of the room, and for the first time in his life, he understood that making space was not the same as giving a gift. Sometimes it meant recognizing that the chair had never belonged to your purse in the first place. Sometimes it meant understanding that privilege was not just about, as if the floor had finally agreed to hold her. That night, Tanesha Bell did not become visible because a rich man finally saw her. She became visible because her daughter played so clearly that the room had to make space. And that was the difference. That was the truth. That was the thing that would sustain them through all the rooms that would come after. All the spaces that would try to tell them they did not belong. They belonged because they had earned it. They belonged because they had created something that could not be ignored. They belonged because talent, when it was true, when it was forged in fire and tested by difficulty, when it refused to be silenced by circumstance, made its own space. And no one, not Graham Whitaker, not his son, not any of the people in the donor lounge with their sealed envelopes and their careless losses, could take that away.